Today we're going to take a look at the restoration of this 80-year-old 1942 Tissot. This is a gorgeous watch, or at least it has the potential to be if we can get this right. So welcome back everyone. If you're new, I'd like to take a moment to let you know in brief what we do. We restore old vintage timepieces back to hopefully their former glory. Now to do this I use 3 cameras to help me better tell the story of the watch and to help you orientate yourself with what's going on. We use 3 different angles and glorious levels of magnification so you can see all the mistakes and comment down below accordingly. Now I like to cover the history of the brand and what made them special in these videos, so during the disassembly I'll flash up some subtitles so you can follow what's going on while I cover the history of the watch. Now, full disclosure, before I go any further, this watch will go up for auction at the end of the video. People seem to like that in the last video I did. I have an embarrassment of riches in the Tissot department, which I'll flash up on the screen now, just so you can have a look. So I have everything from a late 1800s, early 1900s Tissot pocket watch, right through the time periods of Tissot sweep second or center second, right up until a quartz Tissot, which actually belonged to a close family member, which obviously will never go for sale. By the way, if you like the look of any of those watches and you'd like to see them restored, drop a note in the comments below. So I'm sure most of you know Tissot. They're still a very popular brand even today, but the story of how they ended up being Omega's baby brother is quite an interesting one. It also encompasses pretty much what happened to the entirety of the Swiss watch market. So before we open that particular can of worms, I'd just like to go over what really put Tissot on the map. And in my opinion, that was their creation in 1930 of the anti-magnetic watch. In fact, if you Google this, Tissot are often credited with the first people to create one. If you're wondering why you want one, by the way, it's because magnetism and mechanical watches just do not mix. If you find a mechanical watch that's running, massively fast, it's probably magnetism as the culprit. In fact, it's what takes a lot of mechanical watches out of commission. Now, even though Tissot were credited with the first anti-magnetic watch, it's not exactly true. The problems of magnetism and wristwatches were known about way before 1930, and in fact, in 1915, Vacheron and Constantin had already created an anti-magnetic pocket watch. Now, to give Tissot their credit here, they were the first people to bring a anti-magnetic mass-produced watch to market, one you could actually buy for a reasonable amount of money without having to sell a couple of kids or your kidneys or something. And that is definitely a big achievement, and it really put Tissot's name on the map in terms of wristwatch making. Other famous examples of anti-magnetic watches include the 1956 Rolex Milgauss, which contains, in my opinion, one of the funniest second hands in watchmaking. Go have a look if you didn't see it. And the 1957 Omega Railmaster. So Tissot actually beat both Omega and Rolex to the punch with the anti-magnetic mass production watch, and in fact this one in front of us from 1942 is actually labelled as anti-magnetic. But before any of their contributions to wristwatch making with their anti-magnetic watches and their connection to Omega, they started in 1853 as a father and son business, Charles Tissot and his son Charles Emilio Tissot, in the Swiss city of Le Local. It started, as these businesses mostly do, selling gold pocket watches, very expensive, high-quality watches to the landed gentry, basically. Now, the market started to change and wristwatches became somewhat affordable for the more common man. And then towards the late 1920s, early 1930s, with the Great Depression, the market started to change. Kind of Tissot and Omega saw the writing on the wall, and in 1928, Paul Tissot and Gustave Brandt, who was then the president of Omega, began discussing the formation of a holding company which would encompass both Tissot and Omega. Now, in 1930, they made that happen. So Louis Gustave and Adrian Gustave Brandt, who was then, again, the president of Omega, joined the board of directors of Tissot, and Paul Tissot became the director of Omega, thus inextricably linking the companies. Now, they did this to prepare for the registration of their holding company, SSIH, would own both Omega and Tissot. So from 1930 onwards, Both companies shared a production strategy and suppliers, even going so far on occasion as to use the same movements. Now, small changes were normally made to these movements in order to prevent the interchange of parts, although even to this day you can find vintage Amigas and vintage Tissot where you can actually interchange those parts. Now, there were other differences as well, Amiga finishing tending to be of higher quality than Tissot, and Amiga would use Breguet over coil hairsprings and Tissot would use flat hairsprings, so there were other differences also. It's actually not uncommon from this time period to find watches branded Omega Watch Company and then underneath Tissot. So it's a little like the Rolex Tudor, with the Rolex producing the more expensive ones and Tudor producing the more affordable ones. The same was true back in the 1930s with Tissot and Amiga. Amiga would produce the slightly more expensive stuff, or even expensive, should I say, and Tissot would produce the slightly more affordable stuff. Now, this stuff was not cheap back in the day. I mean, it still isn't today, but back in the 1930s, buying a wristwatch or a watch in general was a fairly major investment, which is why if you go and look, most vintage watches have a dress aesthetic to them, a more dressy aesthetic than modern watches tend to do. It's because you could only afford to buy one watch, and that watch would have to do you for formal occasions. So your watch had to look good if you had to stick a suit on and go and meet somebody important. It also had to run when you were ploughing the fields or whatever you were doing. So they were typically given a more dressy aesthetic. This case of having a watch for sports, a casual watch, a dress watch, and a million different watches in your watch box simply wasn't the case for most people back in the past, just because a watch was a major purchase. Now, while all this was going on between Tissot and Amiga, they weren't the only people in the Swiss watch industry to figure out that consolidation meant more profit and an easier way to compete on a global scale. So ASUAG was also formed, which was a consolidation of movement manufacturers, including Abushes SA, along with A-Shield, FHF, and many others, formed into another holding company in 1931. So between them, SSIH, which was Amiga and Tissot at this point, and ASUAG became the dominant forces within Swiss watchmaking. In 1971, ASUAG began the creation of the General Watch Company, which contained watch companies like Cetina, Mido, Oris, Longines, and many, many others. So you're looking at huge holding companies here. And as a side note, Abushes SA in 1979 merged with A-Shield and became the modern ETA that we know today. They drastically cut their product lines. A reason a lot of the Swiss companies went out of business is because when these companies really consolidated in order to maximize profit, they dropped a lot of the brands that were less profitable. Despite this industry consolidation, however, the rising Swiss franc in the 1970s, the advent of competition, the quartz crisis, forced the industry to consolidate further. Or rather, their banks that were their creditors forced them to consolidate to produce more profit and streamline business. So ASUAG and SSIH merged into a larger holding company called SMH. In 1985, this lot would all be renamed to the monolithic Swatch Group we know today. So that's basically how Amiga and Tissot got linked together, and then over the period from 1930 to about 1980, the whole Swiss watch industry got consolidated into what we know as the giant Swatch Group. It's actually a really interesting story that I'll go into depth at a later date, but that's it in a nutshell. In order to understand how Tissot became Amiga's baby brother, you really have to understand an overview of the Swiss industry in general and how you've ended up with a Swatch Group that owns basically everything. So I hope you found that history a little bit interesting. I hope it didn't put anyone to sleep. And I'm going to go back into the restoration now, where we should just be about ready to start getting this thing back together. I cover the nerdy details for you all. All the parts you see disappearing here are just going into a bog standard ultrasonic cleaner, nothing fancy. I'll link the cleaning fluid I use, I think it's pretty good. I'm going to dip a little bit of oil on this very well warm barrel, still all right though, and I'm going to then oil the spring. Now this is a technique I've seen many other people use. I normally don't do it this way. I did it in my jacket drawer, I did it on my jacket drawer, seemed to work to great effect. I also work with these antique vintage watch winders. A couple of you asked me about the price on these. So you get them in a set of 8 normally, and I paid around $100. But I think anywhere from around 80 to 150, you're on a winner. Now, I'm not an expert, but that's just the price that I've seen them go for, and I'd recommend them at that price. Now, I'm trying to be a little careful here. You'll see me be a little bit hesitant as I wind this spring in. There's a danger due to the tension in the spring that the very end of the spring will snap into the winder and snap the hook right off the end of your spring. There'll be tears before bedtime, and you will at that point just need to go and buy a new one. Not that they're that expensive. So I like to use a pair of brass tweezers to tweak that in. There's less chance of damage with brass tweezers than there would be with steel ones. Less chance of damaging the spring, that is. Then push that all the way in. Release the tension a little bit because the spring will be under tension, and then pull the top off. Now, I try and be careful when I do this. I use a sort of hooked brass tweezer to get in there and make sure that I don't pull the spring off when I pull the top off, because it's very easy to do. I'll also discard these cots just because they're covered in oil, and the last thing I want to do is get all that oil on my nice cleaned watch. Now, I'm also going to use a bit of rudder coat on both the top and bottom of the spring, once when it's in the winder and once when it's decanted, just to mop up any excess oil and maybe any particles of dust that might have got in there. Shouldn't be, but you can't be too careful. Now, you also notice a jump cut. The barrel arbor is in, and that's because this one was a pain in the backside and I didn't manage to get it on camera, so sorry about that. Anyway, barrel arbor goes in. I'm sure you've seen me do that before. The lid goes on the barrel, and I use this homemade kind of press tool to press that on. You can buy these. I bought a couple, no idea where they are. They're about a £5. You can even pick them up on AliExpress. No need, in my opinion, to spend a lot of money on that. So here we are on the watch reassembly part, and we're going to start by doing some oiling. Now, I've always said I don't cover every single drop of oil that goes on. It would be a little uninteresting, I think. And also, I don't have the correct magnification for it. Now, a company did send me a microscope with a camera on it, so I'm going to be trying that one out in the next video. So you'll have to let me know what you think there. But basically, we're going to get the first wheel in, or the barrel complete. Then we're going to get the center wheel, the intermediate wheel, and finally the escape wheel will go in. So a little bit of oil for our center wheel. There's a lot of friction there, so you want to make sure, or at least I'm trying to make sure that that's nice and lubricated. And I use this bit of pithwood, it's called. It's very, very soft wood. It's very good for cleaning tools and pivots. So I like to dunk my pivots in there and make sure they're extra clean. Now, in this case, I put the fourth wheel back in before the third wheel, or the intermediate wheel, just because of the long pivot on it. Makes it easier to do in this order. And then finally the escape wheel goes in. Now, there's no oil on these yet because I'll be oiling the jewels on the other side of the watch and, of course, the top side. And now the barrel bridge goes in. So I have a question for more knowledgeable watchmakers than me that might be watching. I normally don't oil the pallet pivots, the pallet fork pivots, because in modern horology, we don't. However, back in the day when this watch was made, they would have done. So my question is, should I not oil them on a modern watch, but oil them on a vintage watch? Now, I haven't had any trouble not oiling them because the pallet fork does not spin 360. It just ticks backwards and forwards. But it's my understanding that, as I said, in modern horology, you simply don't oil it. So anyone given tips and advice on that? Any thoughts you have, bung them down in the comments. Now, the trainer wheels bridge is going back on, and you have to make sure that all the pivots from your wheels are coming through, because I've cranked one of these down before and ended up with a bent pivot. Doesn't happen to me anymore, but it did when I first started. It's very easy to end up with a bent pivot. So you're going to want to put that on, make sure your pivots are coming through, and then I give it a little test by moving the first wheel, or the barrel. And that will allow you to make sure that everything is running nice and freely. Now here, you'll see as a bit of a cock up, to be fair, I forgot to put the set lever screw in before I put the barrel bridge on. Now, luckily enough for us, the barrel bridge is easy enough to fit. It doesn't really have any delicate pivots coming through it, so it's not the end of the world. mistakes happen. Just need to get it all screwed down. Luckily enough, I didn't have it all screwed down before I noticed that the set lever screw was missing. Now I use a bit of pegwood. Again, it was a tip from some commenters to use a bit of pegwood as I'm holding bridges down. The downside with this, if it could be said to be a downside, you can obviously leave or sometimes leave some tiny specks of dust from the pegwood. So you won't see it in the edit because, again, it'll be a little boring. But normally when I'm finished fitting things like this where I've used pegwood, I'll go in with a bit of Rodico just to make sure I haven't left any dust behind. Same goes for micro tiny hairs that are not visible to the naked eye. You'll often want to come in after you've used pegwood or something like it and just give it a little dab around just to make sure you don't have anything in there. Or at least that's something I do. Obviously, this is not a watch repair advice channel. This is simply my journey towards becoming a better watchmaker. And I have to say, it's been so nice to get everybody's help in the comments. Everyone's been genuinely lovely. And thank you all for that advice. So once your bridges are on, I'm going to spin the first wheel again, and just to make sure everything is spinning, running nice and freely with hardly any pressure required to get that to happen. So the top of the watch is almost rebuilt. We just need to rebuild the top of the barrel bridge. So the click and click spring will have to go on. The ratchet wheel and crown wheel will also have to go on. Now at this point in the video, you might have also seen me fit the pallet and pallet bridge here. Now the pallet fork and pallet bridge here. Now, I'm not going to do that in this instance because I watched a watchmaker I have a lot of respect for fit those at the end, and it occurred to me that you might accidentally damage the pallet jewels on your pallet fork by putting that in too soon. Now, I don't know if that's the case. I've never had an issue with it, but just because I've never had an issue with it doesn't mean it couldn't become an issue, right? So I'm going to put those in at the end. Again, if you have a comment on that, which way round you think it should be done, do let me know. So use the pegwood again and a bit of Rodico to clean up any minor dust that might have come off the pegwood, any kind of tiny microfibers from that wood. I'll probably show that at least once during the video, or in fact here. You can see those tiny, tiny specks. Now, because of the lighting and extreme magnification I use, you'll actually see defects in the plating that look like, or could look like dust or tiny hairs. They're actually tiny micro scratches. It would be very easy to light this video in a way where everything looks smooth and perfect, but that's not really what I'm about here. I want to show the nitty-gritty, like I want to show every aspect of this. I want to encourage people that have never done this before that you don't have to be FP Jean to give this a go. Well, it probably helps, but you don't have to be. You can just give this a go. So hopefully I'll encourage some of you who are collectors to do what I did and get in there, get stuck in, and, take stuff apart. It's fun. And you don't have to spend a fortune to do it. Now, cannon pinion goes back on. I press fit that with a pair of bent tweezers. Oil some jewels there. That jewel will be covered up, so it's quite important to get that oil before our minute wheel goes on. A little bit of oil for our intermediate winding wheel. This wheel will act as a bridge between the winding works and the motion works and the keyless works. So that goes on, and then we can start to get our keyless works proper. So our set lever goes on, which is of course connected to the set lever screw we initially forgot on the other side, and that, well, I have to do it this way basically. I pick up the whole movement and I'll screw that in from the other side so it doesn't fall off. There are other ways of doing that, but this one's kind of simple, so I like this one. A little bit of oil around the keyless works, especially on the back of the main plate there where the winding pinion here will actually rub against it. So I like a little bit of, actually I use a grease, and I'll link down all of the oils I use in the description. I use a nice heavy grease for that anywhere there's kind of hard metal and metal contact. And again, a hard grease for those Breguet teeth that you see on both the sliding and winding pinion, this being the sliding pinion. These teeth are just developed for high torque applications, or high torque in watchmaking applications. So our keyless works on this watch is quite easy to build, and in fact the all aspects of this watch are quite easy to build. If you are looking to get started in this hobby, in repairing and maintaining your own collection of vintage watches, which something that can get incredibly expensive and you want to do it yourself, a small second watch is the way to start, in my opinion. So small seconds tend to be the simplest of watches. Don't get a small second with a perpetual calendar on it, otherwise you'll be in a world of issues. But if you just want the most basic of the basic, pick an old watch that's not too expensive with a small second, would be my sort of unsolicited advice there. So I'm just checking our keyless works is sliding backwards and forwards, and our yoke is interfacing correctly with the sliding pinion. And now comes the yoke spring. Now, we used to have a lot of issues with these types of springs. I used to put a piece of plastic over them, a bit of clear plastic. You might have seen that in other videos. And I would actually recommend that, even though there is a small chance that you might get a small piece of plastic stuck. Putting a small piece of plastic over the top when you just get started will give you the confidence to really learn how to manipulate the spring. It did for me, and now I don't need it anymore. Don't get me wrong. The spring will occasionally get lost. But you'll see, I try and be extra careful. So even when I take the pegwood off, I'm still sort of holding that spring down. I'm expecting at any minute for it to just blast off. And it occasionally does. But, you know, I take heart in the fact that I've seen extremely skilled watchmakers ping a yoke spring around the room. So however careful you're going to be, it's going to happen to you at least once. Right, so let's get the cover plate on for the keyless works. It also covers up the minute wheel there. And this plate also has the setting jumper on it, which interfaces with the setting lever. So not too difficult, this one. With these, I like to get them tightened up about 80% and then go back and retighten both sides because there's a bit of flex to them. We need a cap jewel for the bottom balance pivot to come out. And we're going to clean that in some Bergeron B-dip, and we're going to get it ready to go back in. So to do that, I peg the jewel. Just basically means I'm going to rub any hardly stuck or hard stuck dirt on it there. I'm going to dip it in the Bergeron B-dip, and then I'm going to use this tool, which is just a bit of leather on a stick, to polish it up. I'm sure you can buy these, but realistically, just stick a bit of leather to a stick. Now I'm going to oil the jewel with some light oil. I am going to try and get about 50% of the surface of the jewel covered in oil. And then the cap jewel can go back on. And we're pretty much done with the assembly of the back. Now the hour wheel needs to go on and the dial washer, but they'll just fall off if I flip the watch upside down. So I tend to wait until the end, just as it's going back in the case, to do that. We've also still got one big hurdle to overcome, which is the balance needs taking apart so it can be properly oiled and cleaned. Balance complete, so the balance cock, the balance wheel, and all of that good stuff. Now here you'll see me oil that pallet fork I was talking about. Not sure, or the pallet fork jewel, not sure if I should be on an older watch. So again, let me know in the comments. I know in modern horology it's just not done. So to disassemble the balance, I've used a few pins here, and I'm going to get the balance complete off the balance cock by just adjusting this pin so that hairspring, the outer coil of the hairspring, can slide out. Now this is a bit tricky of a maneuver. That's why I use the pins. Now, I'm not sure if that's 100% the most efficient way to do it. In fact, I'm sure it's not, but it helps me not damage that hairspring, and it gives me the bit of confidence that I need to get this part done. So in the future, I might end up actually drilling some holes in a brass plate or something to not have to use the cork, which can transfer a bit of dust. But, you know, it is what it is. By the way, that's the collet you need to adjust, as people asked me to adjust the beat error in a watch like this. So you need to get a small screwdriver in there and adjust the collet. I think I've shown it on another video. I won't be doing it on this one. Beat error on old watches like this typically isn't too much of an issue. It will affect timekeeping and the rate of the watch when the watch is very low on power. To me, that's not so important. And the danger of snapping that collet is quite high on a watch this old. So if it only affects timekeeping at the bottom end of the watch's power cycle, I don't really mind that much. And it's not a huge effect on the time anyhow. And I wind my watch every morning, so I'm never going to see the effects, basically. Now, if your beat error is at 9.9 and your watch just doesn't keep time, then obviously it's going to need adjusting. So again, Bergeron B-dip for all the components of the balance here. and a little bit of oil. This is really why we take this apart, to get this oil on there, so that will oil the top pivot of the balance staff, and then everything needs to go back together. Now you'll see me, I've pinned this so I can get one screw in. I pinned it because, if you weren't aware, this is actually the scale we're working at. So if you see it's a little bit shaky, or you think I take too many precautions, maybe, the scale you're working at is microscopic. Anyhow, I thought I'd just give you a quick look at the scale there. As some people, I know some of you in the audience here are actually watchmakers. A lot of you are hobbyist enthusiasts with more knowledge than me, but for a lot of you, you'll have never have done this, and the scale is actually quite mind-blowing. I, as a collector, looked through the back of a lot of display casebacks when I was collecting and thought, yeah, that's pretty small. But it wasn't actually until I'd taken this stuff apart and put it back together several times that I began to realize exactly how small we were dealing with. So let's get the balance complete back on the balance cock, and of course you need to return that so it contains the outer coil of the hairspring. Now I think I did a zoom in there at some point to give you a closer look at it, but basically that's all back together. I'm going to oil the exit pallet of my pallet fork. It's actually probably better to do this with a pallet fork in the watch. There are multiple methods of doing it. Now, this is not my preferred method of oiling that exit pallet and in turn transferring that oil to the escape wheel. It's just the only one at the moment I can really use to give you guys a look at it on video. So it does work. It's just not the best method. So get the pallet fork and pallet bridge back on, while always, of course, keeping an eye that your pivot has actually come through the top jewel of the pallet bridge. Otherwise, you can crank that down, end up with a bent pallet fork pivot, and you'll have to be a significantly better watchmaker than me to straighten that out and get it to keep a good time. So after this is on, we'll need to add some power to the watch. So I've put the winding stem and crown back in, and I'm just going to give it a few winds. I'm not going to wind it up to the max. Just wind it up enough so I can push the pallet fork backwards and forwards and make sure it has that nice snap to it, that it snaps from one pillar to the other. You don't want to have to push it all the way. If you do need to do that, something has gone wrong. Now, for the balance insertion, I'm going to hold it by the balance cock, of course. I hold it at an angle, and I actually don't move the balance cock here. I move the entire movement holder to get it to spin round, while trying to make sure the pallet jewel is in the pallet fork. And you'll see there when it ticked around, it moved the pallet fork. This is generally a good sign. Now, the balance in this watch wasn't that difficult to fit. It is a bit sticky, so I gave it a tiny little shove just to make sure it was going to go. It's going to go. Now I can double check that it's all correct before I tighten that down. Now, I always like to double and triple check this, just because this is kind of mission critical point. It's also the best part of any of these kind of fix-it restoration journeys, is to see that you got something right. Now, the hands on this watch are terrible. Most of the lume is off. It's very radioactive, so I'm not going to mess with that. I have just dissolved that in some acetate, which I will safely dispose of. I'm not an expert on this, so seek professional advice if you want to deal with that kind of thing. But for me, I just dissolved it in acetate. So I need to mix up some new non-radioactive lume, obviously, and we get that on the hands. Now, full disclosure, I messed this up. So that's about the right consistency, and for some mad reason, I decided to add more binder, more of the lacquer that the powder's mixed with, and this is too thin now. It goes on lovely. It's super easy to put on. But what's going to end up happening is it's going to wick through to the other side of the hands and not look that great. So we're going to come back to these hands. I am definitely not going to leave something that I can do a better job of. Just not in me. Now, again, as I said, I'm not up here pretending to be some super watchmaker, but I do like to get things the best that I can get them. And that hand loom job was definitely not the best I can get it, as you'll see in a minute. So minute wheel and dial washer, dial spacer go in. Now that little washer is actually extremely important. If you don't put that in, there's a chance that your cannon pinion will lift off the watch when the watch is upside down, and your hour hand will just go flapping in the breeze. So if you ever had a watch that's keeping kind of perfect time, and then you put it on and take a run to the shops, and then the time is just absolutely daddy wampus, It might just be a missing dial washer. It's something that easily gets overlooked. Right, going back to these hands, you can see on the video they look terrible. So all of the lume's bled over the beautiful bluing of those hands, and it's just not acceptable. I didn't actually notice it, I'll be honest. Here is not actually when I noticed I messed it up. I had this watch on wrist for about a week before I noticed that on camera it's incredibly visible. By the naked eye, it looked fine. So what I'll do is I'll finish putting this watch together because I don't want to film putting it back in the case again, I'll be honest with you guys. And I will then go back and relume the hands on camera. You'll see me relume it, get a better look at what a proper consistency should look like, or at least what works for me. And then we'll get the new hands on and you can do a direct comparison. So in the case, the reason I'm spinning the hands around there is you always want to check that your hands don't bump into each other, that your hour hand's not going to bump into your small second hand. All sorts of weirdness can happen with hands. Looks simple, can be quite tricky to get a pair of hands fitted well. So from any distance, the hands look kind of okay, but that's still not good enough. For me, I'm not a person that needs to have everything perfect. I believe if you're an absolute perfectionist, you never get anything done. But I do need it to be as good as I think I can do it. And I can do it better than that, which is why in a second we're going to go and redo the loom. I also picked up a trick from a professional dial restoration expert. I'll link that in the comments, which was to use a little bit of orange loom along with the original white loom. And this should give my hands a bit more of an aged look without having to resort to coffee or strong tea or whatever people do for that photina. I kind of like this more. So you'll see this goes on much, much thicker. It's a completely different experience putting this on. And I think this is the consistency I am looking for. So in the past, I've done this a number of times now. And this thicker consistency is what I've always gone for. Maybe this is a microscopic bit too thick, but we'll see what the hands look like when we flip them over. Because if you didn't know, the loom is done on the back side of the hands. So here's the front side of the hands, the bit you're actually going to see. And is it 100% perfect? Probably not. But it's close. It's as good as I can get it. And compared to what it was, it looks, in my opinion, to be 1,000 times better, especially under this level of magnification we have here. Now all that really remains is to push these hands on, check them so they're not bumping into each other, check them so we've got the alignment right, because there's nothing worse than, you know, seeing your watch with the hour hand on 4 and the minute hand on 5 past 4. I kind of hate misaligned hands. It does happen a lot in vintage watches, and there is actually a bit of backplay in vintage watch movements, well, in watch movements in general, so you're never going to get that microscopically perfect. Now, I use a blower here just to make sure there's no dust on the dial. I do the same thing to the crystal, and then this goes in to my very cheap watch press just to press that bezel back in. I also use the same press to get the crystal in there. I didn't show it here, not quite sure why, I just didn't end up capturing it on video, but it is in my other videos if you want to go take a look exactly how I get that crystal in that bezel. Now, I think this thing is absolutely gorgeous. For me, it's got exactly the right level of patina on the dial. Now, I did debate whether to give this thing a complete case refinish. But as I am selling this one, it'll be up for auction, as I mentioned at the end of the video. There are an awful lot of collectors that don't like restored cases. And this one actually isn't that bad. So this one is in perfectly wearable condition, unlike the Zenith I did, which it was just a trash nugget. This one I would consider perfectly acceptable. If it was my personal watch, it'd be a 50-50 toss-up whether I refinish the case or not. I think this one is acceptable. Those hands are looking absolutely beautiful now, in my opinion. The watch in general just looks superb. Very, very, very pleased with the way this one turned out. But don't take my word for it. I'll show you the time graphing results now so you can get a look for yourself. But spoiler alert, it's pretty decent. Now, the amplitude is good. That beat error I don't mind so much on a watch this old, and as I mentioned, it will really only affect the rate or the timekeeping in the watch when their mainspring is low. So as I wind my watch every day, this is not a problem I'm going to run into, and the rate won't change that much anyhow. Now, after it's been on the Timegrapher for about 10 minutes, it hits about -3 seconds on one side, but it hits +4 seconds on the other, so I'll flip this upside down in a second. Now, I'm going to salesman this one for a bit. As I've mentioned, this will be for sale. So if you want to pick yourself an absolutely stunning 1940s Tissot that you got to see the service on yourself, you know exactly what you're buying, go and check my auction out. Here's the watch upside down. I'm not crawling under the desk to show you, take my word for it. It's been lovely talking to you all. I look forward to hearing from you all in the comments. And once again, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.